Summer, 1955. Dearborn, Michigan. A bus carrying 12 Soviet engineers pulled into the parking lot of the Ford River Rouge complex. The bus pulled into the parking lot slowly. The Soviet engineers pressed their faces against the windows. Thousands of cars. Brand new. Chrome bumpers. V8 engines. Stretching as far as they could see. Their American guide smiled and told them, "These belong to the factory workers." The Soviet engineers went quiet. One of them turned to the others and said in Russian, quietly, so the Americans could not hear, that it was impossible, that the Americans had moved cars from other cities, that it was a staged performance, a trick designed to impress the delegation. It was not a trick. These were the personal cars of the men who worked the assembly line. Men who, according to everything the Soviet engineers had been taught, lived in poverty and exploitation under the capitalist system. Nobody on that bus said another word for the rest of the drive. To understand why Soviet engineers were touring American factories in the 1950s, you have to go back to 1929. Lenin himself had said it. Ford plus Taylor equals the engine of industrialization. The Soviet Union needed to industrialize fast, faster than any nation in history. And the only model that worked at that scale was American. On May 31, 1929, the Soviet government signed a contract with the Ford Motor Company. Ford would supervise the construction of a massive automobile plant in Russia. American architect Albert Kahn designed Soviet steel mills, tractor factories, and industrial complexes across the entire country. The Soviets sent their best engineers to Detroit. They studied every machine, every process, every method. They came home convinced that centralized planning would take the American system and make it even better. 30 years later, they came back to check. What they found shook the Soviet Union to its foundation. In January 1958, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a formal agreement. Both countries would allow delegations of scientists, engineers, and academics to visit each other's facilities. Between 1958 and 1988, approximately 50,000 Soviet citizens visited the United States. Under this agreement, the official mission was to collect data, study American methods, bring back knowledge that could modernize Soviet industry. The unofficial mission, the one nobody wrote in the reports, was to prove that the American system was not as advanced as it appeared, that the workers were exploited and miserable, that Soviet industry was closing the gap. Almost nobody came home believing that. The first major post-war delegation arrived in the American Midwest in the summer of 1955. 12 Soviet specialists. 36 days. Their leader was Alexander Izhevsky, the Soviet Deputy Minister of Agricultural Machinery. They visited the Caterpillar factory in Peoria, Illinois, then John Deere in Moline. What they found contradicted everything the Soviet industrial system had been built on. Under Stalin, Soviet industry had standardized around massive heavy tractors on metal tracks, enormous machines built for large-scale infrastructure projects, symbols of Soviet industrial power. The Americans were building something completely different. Small, light, wheeled tractors, with hydraulic attachments that could be changed in minutes. Versatile, efficient, perfectly designed for actual farming. The Soviet engineers saw immediately that these machines were the solution to every problem on every collective farm in Siberia and Ukraine. And then they went completely silent. Because praising an American design in front of American guides was ideologically dangerous. It contradicted the official Soviet doctrine that their heavy tractors were superior. They saw the answer, and they were not allowed to say it out loud. On September 21, 1959, Khrushchev's delegation toured the IBM campus in San Jose, California. They were received by IBM President Thomas Watson Jr. himself. Watson took them to lunch in the factory cafeteria. He gave no special instructions. The cafeteria operated exactly as it did every day. Directors, engineers, assembly line workers, all in the same line, same plastic trays, same tables. Nobody had a private dining room. Nobody had a dedicated waiter. The Soviet Minister of Higher Education, Vyacheslav Yalutin, was so disoriented by the self-service system that he missed the gap in the tray rail and dropped his entire lunch on the floor, in front of the assembled workers and journalists. Khrushchev ignored the incident. He helped himself to fried chicken, onion soup, and orange juice. He examined the Formica tables that could be wiped clean with a single cloth. He counted the absence of waiting staff. When he returned to Moscow, he issued a direct order. Every major Soviet factory would rebuild its cafeteria, using the IBM model. Plastic trays, self-service. One line for everyone. The most powerful man in the communist world had redesigned Soviet industrial dining based on a California lunch. 2 days later, the delegation visited the Mesta machine company in Pittsburgh. Steel mills, heavy forging presses, rolling automation. This was Khrushchev's territory. He had worked in industry his whole life. He understood these machines. An American engineer pointed to a piece of equipment and suggested the Soviet Union probably had better. Khrushchev looked at the machine for a long moment and said something that nobody expected. "Don't be so sure. We have some that are better, some that are equal, and some that are worse. I don't say everything you have is bad and everything we have is good. We can learn from you." An American worker offered him a cigar. Khrushchev accepted it. He took off his own wristwatch and gave it to the worker in return. For a single afternoon in Pittsburgh, the Cold War paused. If this story is landing the way I think it is, stay with us. Because when the Soviet engineers got back to Moscow and wrote their reports, what they put on paper and what they actually saw were two very different things. When Soviet engineers returned from American factories, they wrote two kinds of reports. The first was technical, measurements, tolerances, metallurgical formulas, data that could be used to replicate American processes in Soviet factories, written in cold, precise language, with no social observations, no praise, nothing that could be interpreted as admiration for the capitalist system. The second report was secret, sent directly to the Gosplan and the Politburo. These documents expressed something very different. They warned that the Soviet Union was falling dangerously behind in consumer goods production, civilian computing, and process automation. That if nothing changed, the gap would become impossible to close. The public version said the Americans were equal or behind. The secret version told the truth. Some moments of humiliation were impossible to hide. In 1955, Khrushchev flew to Geneva for a summit conference with Eisenhower. The Soviet delegation arrived in a small twin-engine Ilyushin Il-14, a functional, modest aircraft. Eisenhower arrived in a Lockheed Constellation, a massive four-engine aircraft, gleaming, enormous. The entire world press was watching. Khrushchev's son, Sergei, later wrote that his father was visibly affected. The contrast between the two aircraft told the story of the two countries more clearly than any speech either leader could have given. Khrushchev returned to Moscow and immediately ordered the acceleration of the Soviet civilian aviation program. He had been embarrassed on a runway in front of the world, and he was not going to let it happen again. The Soviet response to American industrial superiority had always followed the same pattern. Copy it. In 1944, 4 American B-29 bombers made emergency landings in Soviet territory after missions over Japan. Stalin confiscated the aircraft. He ordered his chief designer, Andrei Tupolev, to produce an exact copy, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet. The result was the Tupolev Tu-4, and the copying was so literal that Soviet engineers reproduced a small aluminum patch on the fuselage, a battle damage repair from combat over the Pacific, because they were afraid it might be a secret aerodynamic feature. They did not understand. They also reproduced the Boeing factory logo, stamped on the interior control pedals. The word Boeing, cast in Soviet aluminum, on a Soviet bomber. That was supposed to prove Soviet superiority. This was the trap that Soviet industry could never escape. They could copy the machine, but they could not copy the system that kept inventing new ones. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had stopped pretending it could catch up on its own. The government of Leonid Brezhnev made a decision. If Soviet industry could not build what America had built, it would simply buy it. Soviet delegations visited Ford, General Motors, and Mack trucks in Detroit. They studied robotic welding systems, automated casting furnaces, integrated assembly lines for heavy trucks. The Soviet government contracted the American firm Swindell-Dressler to design the foundry for the KAMAZ truck complex, the largest automotive plant in Soviet history. Soviet workers could build the walls, install the machines, run the assembly line. But the system that made it work had been designed in America. The Soviet Union had spent 50 years trying to surpass American industry and ended up hiring American engineers to build it for them. The Soviet engineers who toured American factories between the 1950s and 1970s came home with something their government had not expected them to bring. Not just technical data, understanding. They had seen that the gap between the two systems was not in any single machine or any single technology. The gap was structural. American factories worked because engineers could make decisions without asking Moscow, because suppliers could be changed in days, not years, because workers who produced more earned more, because the system rewarded results instead of loyalty. None of that could be copied. None of that could be imported in a crate. None of that could be mandated by a Politburo decree. A generation of Soviet engineers, factory directors, and industrial planners returned from America knowing exactly what was wrong with their system and exactly why they could not fix it. That knowledge spread quietly through the Soviet industrial apparatus for 30 years. And when Mikhail Gorbachev launched his reforms in the 1980s, when he looked at the Soviet economy and admitted it was broken, he was saying out loud what the engineers had known since they stood in that parking lot in Detroit and counted the cars that belonged to the workers. The Cold War was not lost on a battlefield. It was lost in a factory parking lot in Michigan, and the Soviets knew it long before they admitted it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Cold War Confidential. Every week, the stories they almost kept classified, one secret at a time. Leave a like if this earned it. These stories deserve to be remembered.